Today we're talking about fixed and floating point DSP. Oh, actually, the first question I'd like to ask, right? Because Silica is a small company, and we are facing one of the big guys. So I would like to know, just to get a simple survey, how many people have not heard of Silica before? Yeah, that's expected. So now you do. Well, actually, we started our company in 2002, and we have our own factory in China, and then we have an office in Amsterdam. So we're doing pretty good in Europe and China. So now we are trying to tackle North America more. So hopefully you'll hear about the name Silica more and more in the near future. And okay, back to the topics. Okay, I'll explain the setup here first. The setup here is every audio that's transferred, we do via Dante. So it is spoken here, all right? So we've got an iMac. We'll play the virtual sound card, Ethernet out. So the Dante protocol will go out to the router, and it will go into the QR, which is our new product, Solero QR, quarter rep, 1U. It can do 16 channels, so it's pretty cool. And from the QR, it sends the audio to the Dante amplifier, right? So all the audio that we are going to play back, it's all digital transport. So there's no like A to Ds, D to As, stuff like that. All right, and the Mac here, the MacBook, is used to control the QR. So you saw those kind of like blocks and faders and buttons, all those things, is located in the software here in the MacBook. All right, that's cool. So today we're talking about fixed versus floating point. When I thought of that, I make up two pictures. So fixed point, a guy sitting very tight on a chair. Floating point, you can sit in the cloud, if you can. So I'd like to ask, anybody who came to this seminar expects something that you'll pick up after the seminar about fixed point and floating point? Can you raise up your hand? Some. Oh, that's good. So the others may go. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, for those guys who want to know, right? May I ask you, like, what do you say about your level of understanding between fixed point and floating point? I'll just do a quick, survey again. You know close to nothing? Raise up your hand. Honest people. You know something? At least the equation formula. Good. Experts. Oh, there's an expert. Oh, you can come and talk. Okay, at least I know, right? So I know at least how to present the following. But my question is, if you want to know something nowadays, right? I remember like back in like 20, 30 years, if you want to know something, you have to attend a course in university or buy a book or something. But now, what do? You
Google it.
You Google, right? Go to the internet. So my question to you is, if you want to know about this, why don't you just Google it and then learn it yourself? Anybody can tell me why you don't do that?
It is very math intensive, and some people are very intimidated by the math.
So it's the people and the math.
And the math.
Okay. Anybody else?
It's just theoretical, right?
Huh?
It's theoretical, not practical.
Not practical. I guess it's how they say it, right? How the people. This.
Probably because there's like 1,000 other things they have to research.
Once you go into it, it's like, okay. Hold on. Yeah.
The presence of alternative facts on the internet.
Good one.
Well, there's too many explanations out there, and maybe one or two of them are right, and right or wrong. But you do have to spend a lot of time figuring out
Yeah. There are two things I found in internet. One thing is what you said, like when you read it, you don't know if it's true or false. You just don't know, right? You just read it. And the second one is I found like those people talking in the forum. Oh, fixed point is definitely better. Why? Whatever, right? And then floating point is definitely better. Why? And then, right? So I guess today I want to tackle a little bit of the technical stuff, so a little bit of the depth of the definition, but I don't want to go too deep because as somebody just mentioned, it's too mathematical and we're not in math course, right? But I'll put look a little bit into that, and once you understand it, then from that we'll come up to some kind of conclusion, like which one is better, right? So the first thing I want to do a playback an audio, and then I will play it via fixed point and floating point, and I won't tell you which is which. And then you just hear it and see what you think, all right? I think that's a good thing to start. You saw me playing with the two buttons, right? So which one you think it sounds better? Anyone?
One button's redder than the other.
Definitely not the very first part of the song, the one you flipped the first time. It was a little louder, but then you brought it down, and it's definitely a much wider low end and a much clearer high.
Are you that sure?
And it doesn't sound as grainy either.
Sorry. Huh?
It sounds the same.
Okay, we can come to that later on, all right? So, so we've got this. Okay, now we go into the technical description of what's fixed point first, all right? So probably most of the people, pretty familiar with this kind of representation. Right? I try to make it as simplest as possible. So let's say if it's a 32-bit fixed point integers, so there are 32 bits. So each bit can only be 0 or 1, right? So the first bit is the sign bit, meaning if the first bit is a 1, then the number is negative. If the sign bit is 0, then it's positive. Easy? So there are only 31 bits left, because one bit is gone, right? So now the possibility for the bits becomes 2 to the power of 31. Okay, so far okay?
Yeah.
Still in here? Okay. So now, because we do this possibility values, that becomes minimum is minus this number, and maximum is this number. And the reason why the max is 1 less than that, because it got a 0 that we didn't count. All right, so far, okay? Easy? Okay. All right, so the integer value is like whatever times the base, which is whatever number. So let's say if it's all zeros, then it's 0. If it's 0, 1, then it's a 1, right? 0, 1, 0, then it's 2, so on and so forth. So you have this number, right? Integer value equals -1 to the power of sign, just meaning if it's a 1, then it's -1, if it's 0, then it's 0. And then another bit. Alright? So far okay? Now we move to the more complicated floating point. Does it look more complicated?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. But it's not that complicated after we understand it. So what floating point does is it steals 8 bits. Instead of all 31 bits representing binary bits, it steals 8 bits, preserved to be the exponent. Exponent meaning, if you got a number, if you times 10 to the power of x, right, then x will be the exponent. But of course, this is binary, so it will be 2 to the exponent. And when IEEE define the standard, they don't want to define a positive or a negative both in these 8 bits, right? They don't want any more sign bits. Right? So what they do is this number here is all positive. So 8 bits meaning 0 to 255, right? And in their standard, they take 0 and 255 out, reserved for special cases. And to get the real exponent, you minus 127. So you minus about the half of the 255. So you got half of the positive and half of the negative to be the exponent. So the maximum exponent positive is 127, and negative is 126, minus 126. So far okay? Still with me? Good. And now there's a mantissa. Mantissa is just a number, just like the good old fixed point. It's the same thing. But when they define it, this just represents the fraction, right? So it only represents whatever number this is. It's like 0 point whatever. And then they add 1 to it. So the value will then be minus 1 to the power of sign, just like the fixed point. So if the sign is a 1, then it's -1. If it's 0, then it's a positive number. And then 1 plus this binary fractional, and then times 2 to the power of this number, minus 127. So that's it. So that's the definition of a floating point, 32 bits. Then you may ask, why do they do this, right? Well, we can come to that comparison later in the next slide. But for now, some observation. Because they steals the 8 bits of the exponent and leaves only 23 bits behind. So now, the mantissa, which is the fractional part, can go from 0 to 0.9999981, or all zeros to all ones. Right? So when you add 1 to it, meaning that value will be 1 to 2. Right? See? 1 to close enough to 2. And if we do some math, for positive minimum value is 2 to the power of minus 126, which is approximately 1.2 times 10 to the power of negative 38. On the contrast, the positive max, 2 to the power of 128, approximately 3.4 times 10 to the 38. So now do you see the difference between fixed point and floating point?
So it's higher resolution because there's more stuff in there?
It's a range.
Okay, I'm going to answer that question now, because I was thinking maybe we can delay it and think. The resolution hasn't changed, because for both systems, they are both 32 bits. Nothing is lost, right? Both has 32 bits.
You're utilizing it specifically for audio rather than the original math which was designed for computers in a way?
No, actually audio can heavily use floating point. That's why we use floating point in our DSPs. Right? Yeah. Anyone? Why is that so extreme of a difference? Oh, the expert, yes.
Well, you have a big range, so you have the same numbers you can represent, but they're spread over a wider space.
Yeah, so yeah, in a sense, the range is increased tremendously, right? But you got to give out something in between. So what is that? So we go to the next slide. So to make things simple, I don't want to compare a 32-bit fixed point versus a 32-bit floating point. I mean, it's just way too wild, right? So I simplify it so that it is 5 bits. I call it 5-bit knockout. So it's clearer what you are seeing, right? I guess it's easier, especially for the one who's not, expert, right? To understand what we are talking about. So we put a 5-bit knockout between the fixed and the floating. So for the fixed, good old fixed is the same thing. And we are going to compare the two unsigned. So we don't worry about the sign, because for comparison, it doesn't really matter, right? With a sign or without a sign. So it's easier to compare unsigned to unsigned. So fixed, I've got 5-bit unsigned. Same old stuff, right? So it's 000, 001, 010, 011, 010, right? Okay, got the point. But for the floating, it's a bit different. I use 3 bits for exponent and 2 bits for mantissa, right? So for the mantissa, because it's a fractional, in binary, the first bit will be 0.5 in decimal. And the second bit will be 0.25 because it's half, right? Because binary you shift, you half, so it's 0.5, 0.25, 0.125, 0.0625, 0.03, 125, right? So you got the idea. Exponent is minus 3. Because remember, in the standard, it's minus 127, which is 1 below the midpoint. So you get both the positive and a negative exponent. So we do the same thing here. Minus 3, so you get the positive exponent and the negative exponent. So far okay? With me? Still? Good. So example for the floating point, because for this one I don't think I need to explain more. For the floating point value representation, let's say you got a number of 01001. So the exponent part will be 010, which is a 2, right? So 2 to the power of 2 minus 3 is 2 minus 1. So that's the exponent part. And the base number part, 01, as I said, is 0.5 plus, because it's 0, right? This one is 0, so that's why 0.5 times 0, and then 0.25 times 1, which is this one, right? And then you add 1, and that's the base number, and that's 1.25. So far okay? Still with me? Okay. So now the floating point 01001, the actual number in decimal is 1.25 times 2 to the power of minus 1 equals 0.625. Any question here? Because I see some confusing faces already, so. Any question?
Is the point that it seems like it's less math?
You mean fixed point?
Or, yeah, I mean floating point versus fixed point.
You mean fixed point less math, or the floating point less math?
Floating point less.
Well, at least to get the number, you have to do more math to get the number, right? So at least in this process, for us to get this number, we have to go through this.
Right, and that's a lot of work for the computer, wouldn't it? More work than doing the other one, or what do you think?
We'll talk about that when we go to the conclusion.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So okay. So next slide. I can move on.
Wait just a sec.
Remember this 3 is just because I picked 5 bits, that's why it's a 3. So if I take 7 bits with 4 exponential, then this will become 7. So it's just 1 below the bit point. So you can have half the positive exponent and half of the negative exponent. And that's the design by IEEE standard. Right? All right, next slide. So we're going to do this, all the math for you. So fixed point, pretty easy, right? 0, 31, done. Floating point, oh, we have to do math, just like what I did before, but now we put all the possibility and then got the number here. So when I plot all these numbers, which is on top, you see how the blue is regularly 1 bit, 1 bit, 1 bit, 1 bit. Very regular, right? But the thing for the floating point, you see how it goes? You see how it goes? When the number is really small, it's all packed here, right? And then it expands, 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 expands to there. So that's how floating point get its range, right? So if you count the number of possibilities, they are both 32, right? They are both 32. But for the fixed point, it's very even. You got your 32. But for floating, it's like, okay, I'm here. Okay, a bit more, and then lastly it's like jumping a big range. So that's how they got the big range. So far, okay? Not too bad? Okay. Oh, and one thing to note is if you look at the number, right, this is one interval, and about here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's one as well. And that is where it's about the same. So that means when the numbers is smaller than this range, floating point has more representation. When it's larger than this range, fixed point has its representation, better representation.
So would you define that as more samples per bit?
Not a sample per bit, meaning for both, you've got 32 possibility numbers. You don't know what the numbers are. But for the fixed point, it's very even, so it's like 0, 1, 2, 3. But for floating point, it's like 0, 0.15625, 0.1875, 0.2185, and then jump to the end, it's like 16, 20, 24, 28. So that's the difference. Right? So the number of representations are exactly the same. But floating point choose to have different characteristics along from minimum to maximum.
Yeah, I'm trying to translate that into sound. What is the effect of doing that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll go to that later.
Okay.
So what I'm getting from this is that the floating point, you're able to store a higher range, so you're able to store more numbers, but with a sacrifice of accuracy once you get to higher numbers?
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah, you can say that. Yeah. So it decides to keep like 10, 12, 14, 16, 20, 24, 28 to go further instead of 26, 20. Just one reminder too. Although this is 31 is bigger than 28, but if you look at the trend, the more bits, it go way further away. So once you go to 32 bits, it's like no comparison, right? Just like the min-max I just showed you, 10 to the power of 38, right? Yeah, so the higher the number, the worse resolution, but it got there. Fixed point, very consistent, but it cannot go there, right? Okay.
So what you're saying is it's LSB at this end and MSB at the other end. Zero is LSB,
Oh,
significant bit.
oh no, 0 is just this 0, so I put it up there.
Okay, so you're not representing LSB to MSB.
No, no. This is to show 0, 1, 2, 3, and here 0, 1.562, so it's right here. So this is a number line, right? 0 to 31 is a number line. So fixed point is regularly from 0 walking to 31. But floating point is like walk a lot between 0 and 1.
So there's no correlation between LSB and MSB on that graph?
Not on this one, no. This is just a number line showing
Right, understood.
there. Yeah.
I think what you're trying to say is the fixed point is a linear representation, and the floating point is an exponential representation.
Yeah, you can say that. It's very similar to like voltage and dB in a sense, right? dB is in log scale, right? So you can get to the range that you can get with dB. But if it's voltage, then it's like a huge number. Similar idea. Because dB, you have log, that means you have to do 10 to the power of x as well. So very similar.
So
Okay.
really,
Yeah.
it's just the way you map the quantization levels with the available numbers. Floating point gives you fine resolution at low levels and coarser resolution at high levels, and the transition between the two is an exponential curve. Whereas in fixed point, it's just linear.
Yeah, you can say that too. Yeah, you can say that too. Yeah, you can say that too. All right, seems like everyone's getting that. That's good. I think that's the most technical stuff in the seminar already, so everybody passed. So, next one. So one funny thing is like when you go, when you ask DSP engineers, right? Everyone has a different opinion. That's why when you go to a forum, right? You argue with somebody. Is that fixed point better or is that floating point better? It's always somebody has a different opinion because they may not be talking about the same thing. You know what I'm trying to say? You know, if you compare cars, right? Oh, I like this car, I like that car, right? Oh, mine is more expensive, but mine is faster, right? It doesn't make any meaning, right? So that's the same thing applied to fixed and floating. Because for fixed, DSP engineer always use the fixed, and I don't know if you heard a term called scaling. It scales all the time because it has its limited range, so it has to do the range scaling. So let's say somebody wants to go to audio, right? If you want to turn on 40 dB gain, so it's out of the range. If the fixed point is like +1 to -1, so they have to expand the fixed point to meet the +40 dB range, right? So give an instance. Floating, if you remember, we mentioned that the minimum is about -2 to 31, power to 31, and the max is 2 to the power of 31. So it's just a huge range. And fixed integer just regularly doing its thing, right? So if fixed integer is going to match the floating point min-max, it can do it, right? Just stretch, stretch, stretch. And what you find is about -2 to the power of 23 or 2 to the power of 23, they are about the same. You can see that that one, right? So we'll try with the other scaling. So floating now, okay, if the fixed just do, oh, I'm going to do -1 to +1. So that will be -2 to the power of 0, which is -1, 2 to the power of 0, which is 1. Okay, so now I do a totally different scaling. Instead of the max, I do plus and -1. And then the fixed point, do its thing regularly. And floating point, it just does the same thing, right? The scale is the same thing. So around -2 to -8, that's about the same. And now we come to one conclusion where if the mean is -2 to the power of x, 2 to the power of x, whatever x is, you do up 8 minus the exponent, you got a similar resolution. And that's where we call it resolution now. Resolution meaning you walk one step, I walk one step. So we are close. Here, floating point, walk a big step, fixed, walk one little step. When the number is small, floating point, walk a really small step, but fixed point, walk a bigger step. All right, so far clear? Yeah? And the reason why this is -8, the reason being is floating point, remember, steals 8 bits to be exponent, right? Because it steals the 8 bits. So when fixed point loses the 8-bit advantage, then it's about the same, right? Because now you talk about 23 bits plus the sign versus 23 bits plus a sign and exponent, right? So if exponent is not, if they match, if exponent is 1, then this matches because both are talking about 23 bits plus sign bit. Resolution, the same. Make sense? Cool. All right, so everybody got that?
I have a question.
Yes.
Isn't it the coarseness of the fixed bit scheme, isn't that what makes you need to use dither to smooth out low-level signals so that you don't hear the quantization jumping?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. If you go into fixed point DSP algorithms, you'll hear terms like scaling, dithering, truncation, protection, overflow protection, those kind of things. And it all comes because the fixed point has a limited range. And when it goes to here, the floating point is still doing its nice stuff of determining the small resolution, the preciseness, but the fixed point cannot do it. That's why they have to do the dithering. So let's say the signal is less than 1 bit, so they have to do like 0 bit, 1 bit, 0 bit, 1 bit to represent maybe 0.5 or maybe 0.4. So that's how they achieve it, and that process is called dithering.
Would you then be able to get away without using dither in a floating point system with low-level signals, but perhaps you might need to dither high-level signals because of the coarseness of the quantization interval?
Yeah, good question. I don't know who will do the dithering in the lab. We can come to that, right? We can come to that, but maybe I can answer it now. Is normally, right, for audio systems, how many dB you're going to turn on system-wise? Let's say you've got you buy a DSP, right? Or you install it. Okay, how many dB gain you're going to put up?
Are we at our home or are we in a live?
Doesn't matter. Whatever real life application is.
75.
Okay, 75 dB?
80, 35.
80? Okay. All right. 80 dB, right?
Sure.
Okay. But remember the 8 bits? 8 bits times 6 is 48 dB, right? So from 0 to 48 dB, the floating point covers is no sweat if you compare to the fixed. So maybe you're talking about another 40 dB. So that means you are right in a sense if you compare this range, fixed point wins, right? Because in this range, the floating point has not enough resolution compared with the fixed point, right? But if you don't talk about this range, talk about this range, then floating point wins big time.
So, sorry, are you suggesting having higher recording levels into this machine or lower recording?
No, I'm just saying in real life audio applications, right? How many dBs you need in your system, right? So this is let's say it's 48 dB, right? Let's say maximum 48. So 0 dB is here, right? Meaning fixed point only wins from 0 dB to 48 dB. Let's say 80 dB, let's say. So fixed point will win 80 dB minus 48 dB in that range. So that means 80 down to 32 dB gain range, fixed point wins. But anything below that, floating point wins. So my question, why do I ask the question is, like in real life application, right? If you really boost it up to the top 48 dB, then fixed point wins. But anything below, then the floating point wins.
So hypothetically, like a snare drum obviously doesn't put up 80 dB, it puts up a lot more than that.
Well, if you put the gain up, then you can, right?
It depends on your noise floor in your system.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say here is let's say you buy a DSP processor, like it allows you to do 80 dB gain headroom internally. So if you really use it like up to 80 dB, so that means from 32 dB to 80 dB, a fixed point is better than floating point. If it's below 32 dB, floating point wins over fixed point.
Let's not use terms like better.
Because more resolution.
That's better.
More resolution, right?
Yeah.
But I can show you some demos later on, so to explain my point clearer.
Has there ever been hybrid systems that have been designed that would incorporate fixed and floating point in the decision process when you're dealing with level?
Yeah, actually that's what we do. That's what we do. Like, if we hit some cases where we find, like, let's say in this range, let's say, and we know it is in this range, and definitely fixed point. If we know it ahead of time though, right? You cannot like do a processor and you don't know how the user is operating. If you're operating down there, then you lose your benefit. All right?
I guess you can't switch the processing and the math dynamically as the signal.
Yeah, that's another challenge. Yeah, another challenge. So let's say you have a signal, then based on the signal, you change your algorithm. It can be done. Like a lot of algorithms like real-time EQing or something like that, depends on situation, I think they do that. Right? Depends on what comes in and they're sure they're in this range and they know fixed point is better, then they use fixed point, but in some range they know that they're not sure or they know floating point is better, then they'll use floating point. Or maybe for most of the developer, they don't really care. They just put floating point in, I'm done. Right? You don't know. Okay, so maybe we should have some listening test. So how do we do audio applications comparison? And that's, some people already raised up this question, right? How does it apply to audio? Oh, okay. Anybody guess what this picture is?
Revolution recording.
Who said that? You work here?
Yeah, I think I took that picture, or Heather took that picture. So
Is that right?
Yeah.
You should not be here. How can you tell, right? If you don't know, how can you tell?
It's taken from that corner.
Oh, okay, then fixed point is good for you.
Ronnie, he's got bad eyes. That's what it looks like to him.
Okay, now the resolution is better. Better. And this is this room. Okay. So,
It's a very good demonstration. That was good.
you like it?
It was very good.
Good. So, audio application. How do you do gain in fixed point? So everybody knows with fixed point, it's very easy to do 6 dB gain. Actually 6.02 to be exact, right? But everybody says 6 dB, you shift a bit, right? That means if you got a number in binary terms, you just shift it by 1 bit, then the volume will be minus 6 dB lower. Yeah? So this to show you, let's say you've got a fixed signal, full range, minus 6 dB, you lose 1 bit, right? It becomes 31. Yeah, I don't count the sign bit here, just do the unsigned, easier. So minus 48 dB, you lose 8 bits. Minus 96 dB, you lose 16 bits. Minus 144 dB, you lose 24 bits. And if you go to extreme 192 dB, you lose everything. Right? And that's fixed point. So you have to be very, very careful with the gain structure of the fixed point. In this case, normally I would say 48 would pretty much the maximum. If you go anything further, your signal representation is getting lower and lower. And eventually it will be gone. And look at our floating point counterparts. Right?
Doesn't care.
Good answer, Barry.
It doesn't care.
You should work on the technical side. So remember, floating point steals the 8 bits for exponent and keeping the 23 bits for we call it mantissa, which is a fractional number. So what do? 0 dB, they got all the numbers here, right? Minus 6 dB, they don't shift. All they do is they use exponent number minus 1. And all 23 bits stays. Minus 48 dB, okay, minus 8 here. Or minus whatever. And then 33 bits stays. In this case, the floating point never loses any number representation. In audio terms, no distortion, right? Because you keep all the information, correct? You're not losing any of the information like the fixed point counterpart does. So they'll show you, if you really want to use the gain, as long as it's not in the top 48 dB, anything you do below the headroom minus 48 dB, you have 0 loss of data representation. Isn't that cool? Even go down to 192, no change. And that's the advantage of floating point.
I've heard it said that when you're using a floating point system, you can't overload your internal buses. Like if you're using a DAW that does floating point map, you can pump anything into your mix bus and it'll give you a level above 0 dB full scale. How?
How? By messing up the system. I use an analogy, right? So if you look at this, it's like a car with an engine, a very powerful engine, fastest in the world, right? But what do you need? You need a driver who knows how to drive. If somebody designed this system, I minus 190 dB and then do some EQing, remember the signal is really small. After you do this, although here the signal is not is lossless, right? It stays the same. But you use this number and do all kinds of EQ and stuff. Remember, this signal is really small. And then you do the EQing, and then delay, and then compressor, and then you boost back up 192 dB. It will give you an approximate answer. It is very similar to a calculator, right? A calculator with, let's say, even 30 bits of fractional, right? If you do like 99.99 divided by 127.23 times 1 point. So ultimately, it gives you a number, but it's close enough, not exact one.
Because it can't show you billions of characters.
And that's exactly what floating point gives you. So if you are the driver, you have to make sure you don't go crazy with your powerful engine. You have to know approximately what range, approximately play it. But in the end, you can do whatever you want. But maybe in the end, you have a little bit more noise, a little bit more distortion. Not crazily much, but you have some. So that's how you got it.
To continue your analogy, could it be equated to those steps being like your gears and your transmission, and then everything else being your RPM to achieve your speed, your desired speed?
Yeah, you can say that. Like meaning there are a lot of factors. Like the car has all the engines and good stuff, it's all ready to go. But you as a driver, you just have to drive it right. Okay? Okay, so now maybe we'll do some audio demonstration instead of me talking. Okay, so let's go up here. Okay. So we use the QR and design this schematic. We call it a design file. So I do the design file so that I can have the test here. So basically, this test is like this. I've got a pre-fader and a post-fader, so I can adjust the gain before and after this block. And the first controls here, pass 1, it's the number of bits. So you see 24.00. I think maybe it's small at the at the back, but it shows 24. So this is 24 bits right now. So the demo I showed you earlier when I started the seminar, I compared the 24 bits versus the floating point gain, right? So AB, AB. And in theory, yeah, that should be the same. So whoever says the same, yeah, you are correct. Because internally, the A to D is 24 bits, pass the signal to the fixed point 24 bits, do nothing, pass to the D to A 24 bits. And floating point get the 24 bits, exponent 1, so it's the same thing, pass the D to A, so it's the same thing. But now we are going to do some testing and see if we play around with some of the factors, what will happen. And the one in the middle is a fixed gain. So instead of a floating gain, so floating gain is a DSP algorithm we use based on the floating point, that 32-bit floating point, and do the gain. Fixed gain is like what you saw in the picture, right? You just shift for the -6 and shift left for the +6. You get the idea? So you can listen to it now. All right? Okay. First,
help.
Huh?
That's, that, in this specific example, dither would help.
A little, very minimal. Because if you're talking about, remember the PowerPoint I showed? If you shift it so many bits, the information left may be 10 bits. So even you do the dithering at the end, so it becomes 11 bit. 10.5 they say it, so.
Well,
So-
not that so much, but just that it would smooth the transitions between these coarse quantization layers.
Yeah, you can try some, but it's still, dithering can do like the last bit for you, but other than that, it cannot do much. Unless you're talking about artificial intelligence. I know what you're saying, I create this waveform, but that's obviously not. Fixed gain and float gain. Any question here?
How many bits were in that last one? Was the representation on that last
4 bits,
one? That was 4 bits?
yes.
And how about the one before that? The one that, the second one?
Same thing.
Oh, it's a fixed gain, meaning it's like the PowerPoint I showed.
Well, in the fixed game, but how many representational points or bits were you using on that?
24.
So that was all 24?
Yes, but the reason why it got that big distortion is because it's shifting too much, just like here, right? If you shift too much, the information left is not enough to represent what you hear.
Yeah, it's not representing the music.
Yeah, so you're just hearing this, let's say 14 bits, right? And then 14 bits, you've got this like 0, 1, and that's what you are hearing. Right?
Can I just ask an extrapolated question on that? Just, or I don't know if you may cover this in another situation, but when you are setting up gain structures and recording, there's things you hear where now in the digital domain you don't need to worry about it so much. So theoretically, you could track at a lot lower level, and if you're using a lot of track counts just to keep the headroom and the mixer under control, you could track it a lot lower and then move everything up in the mix. Looking at your situation the way you represented it tonight, I'm not exactly sure that is what.
Yeah, so the conclusion for that is if you try to, let's say a signal comes in, you drop it by 80 dB, let's say, and then do all the processing and put it back up by 80 dB. So it's like 0 dB coming in, drop 80, processing, increase 80, back out. Is that what you're trying to say?
I mean, it sounds like to me that from your optimal recording, when you're in the field of your recording, you should really be dropping it below minus 48 dB.
Oh yeah, but I'm talking about DSP development inside the DSP chip. So anything can happen. So it's not the operation, oh, you got a mixer, I'm not going to go beyond 10 dB, and I'm not going to suppress lower than minus 10 dB. But inside the chip, we've got so much calculation, it's just like a calculator. You keep on multiplying, dividing and stuff. So you actually have those kind of range inside the chip. So we actually have maybe minus 40, minus 60, and that's very common.
But it is correct, if you have a system, tracking a digital recording system that records floating point, it would be okay if you drop the signal digitally before you record it. You wouldn't lose any precision.
But in fixed point, you would.
Yes, that would happen.
Yeah, so let's say you don't consider the DSP algorithms developed inside the chip. It is only how you operate it. It's very simple. Like if you put it to the headroom minus 48, the fixed point will win. Whatever below it, floating point will win. And that's the rule of thumb.
Yeah, so if you keep your digital signal levels in your processing chain above minus 48, the rounding, the math errors, because the mantissa is shorter, give you more errors in floating point.
Yes.
If you keep the signal up.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. You're exactly right.
But within the reasonable dynamic range you would normally work, you would probably rarely run into the situation for floating point would actually work.
Unless you're running below, less than like in a speaker application. If you're running below 48 dB from full power.
Yeah.
You've got a system that's capable of reaching 130 and you're below 80,
Yeah.
then you could actually be where a floating
But
point
then
would
you're
be better.
really off on your gain.
Well, no, I'm talking about you got a pair of speakers here that are capable of hitting 130 dB in the room.
Yeah.
And you're actually listening at 60 dB, you might actually be better in that case with the float.
But you say the SPL range for the ear is about 120 dB, right?
Yeah.
So that 120 dB is covered fine by a 2450 system.
Yeah, well, we can imagine if you go to a concert, right? It's just like here, right? You've got the big speakers at the front. Like you walk by, right? You still can hear a little bit of music going on, right? Versus you're like way at the back of the arena is full power, and that's the comparison, right? So unless this is in full power in that 40 dB range, then maybe you sit at the back, then fixed points will be better, right? But you won't be standing here, right? So that means the conclusion is anything below the headroom minus 48 dB, right? Even if you walk or front row or there, like most of the people won't be hearing your max minus 48. You won't push it to that limit, right? All night, right? All night, like all the songs has to be in that range to take that advantage, right?
Or you could be, in a concert, you could be running in the top 48 all
Yeah. If you do that, then fixed point will win.
I
Yeah.
think one of the comments that you just made was kind of interesting to me because you called it in the system. And, you know, early on when DAWs came out and they were talking about fixed point versus floating point, there was a few pretty smart guys that said, well, if you want to do a proper workstation, you need to be 40-bit fixed point. So part of this is also designing a system for its proper use and also understanding what technology was available at the time, because back then, you know, floating point processors was like a Motorola 56001 or something like that.
Mhm.
It's a lot different today, so it's also the practicalities of designing a system for its use.
Yeah, and some behind the scenes, if you do DSP development, if you use fixed point, then for every DSP module, you have to determine what's your min max going into the module and what's the min max of the coefficient you'll be using. And if in case you're not enough, you have to do the scaling, just like what I showed you, right? Scaling larger, smaller. So maybe you scale it larger to get the higher range. And once you finish that, you have to scale smaller to get the smaller range. Development alone is not that easy, right? Even if you can finish the task, how does it compare to the floating point? Of course, some people will say, oh, after I've done all this, it's better than floating point. And I'm not going to argue about that, right? Because this is just to show you if it's in that range, right? If they develop everything in that range, then fixed point will win, right? But anywhere else, the floating point will win. So that's why, like, I see a lot of arguments, you know, in the forum saying fixed points better, floating points better. Depends on what you are doing, right? Yeah.
What happens to our bit requirement when we start doing digital filters?
Digital filters refer to EQ or?
Yeah. Like an IIR filter.
Well, for fixed point, if it's not a lot of multiplication and division and out of range kind of thing, then fixed point is doable. Simple to do, and you know. But fixed point has a danger where because it doesn't get to the low resolution, so some of the calculation when it comes to low frequency, it requires a really low number. In that case, then your system will suddenly go silent. It may. If you push down to 30 hertz, 20 hertz, well, suddenly the system. And it is the DSP algorithm that will do that. Unless they already put it in their mind and then avoided it already. Yeah.
So Johnny, if you look at 24 bits, we talk about an system of 24 bits, spans about 144 dB, which is more than what the ear can
Mhm.
from the noticeable signal to our eardrums. So if you're using fixed point, you kind of look at it like if you have an analog system.
Mhm.
You don't want to be all the way up at tripping, but you don't want to be too
Yeah.
far low either because you're using dynamic.
Yeah. So to answer your question, sure. To answer your questions, let's take a minus 48 dB here.
Yeah.
So regardless, because of the minus 48 dB, you are losing 8 bits already.
Yeah.
So the signal can be here, can be full range, right?
Yeah.
So maybe when I play the music, it is somewhere here because it's not hitting the max, right?
Yeah.
So 32 minus the 8 becomes 24 with the sign bit 23. And then maybe from the headroom is another 6 bits, right? So maybe we'll talk about 16 and 17 bits. And on top of that, if you want to do gain, right? Because I have 2 gains, remember? If you, on top of that, you want to do some gain, EQ and stuff, you have to constantly shifting.
So if you make
The
a
bits.
DSP process about like you're making, it would almost be impossible because you have to have meters at each block and the user has to make sure he's utilizing the fixed point range properly all the way through the system.
Yeah.
That's the advantage of floating
Yeah.
point. You only have to think about the gain at the end.
Yeah,
The
and
advantage of floating point is if you do an IIR filter and you have your 5 coefficients, when you, if some of the signals are really small, when you add 2 floating point numbers, right, you have to shift them to make them fit, and then the low one just disappears. if
Yep.
It's below the 24-bit.
Yep.
And therefore you get 24-bit IIR artifacts, which we normally fix when fixed point processes for 24-bit, we would have a first order noise feedback to feedback a quantization error. We don't need that in 32-bit fix, but we actually do need that in 24-bit flow.
yeah, well, put it this way, floating point, if you go to that precision, right? 24 versus even 16 or something like when you're losing the bits, the conclusion is like you just have to take one, right? Let's say you go to floating point, you close your eyes, just put your formula in, it gives you a result. Is that good enough, right? Not good enough, okay, then you have to think of other ways, right? And fixed point, you have to worry a lot of things, maybe to get the same result, or maybe a little bit better, or maybe a little bit worse. So conclusion is that has to be determined by the DSP developer,
Yeah.
right? He decides, in this case, should I go floating point or should I go fixed point, right? So
Yeah, but exactly, and that decision can be made at the time of design by the DSP engineer, where with fixed point, you make a system that is very complicated for the end user to use because he has to set the gain all the time. So I totally agree with you. You use a few extra instructions on the IIR, and then you get the best of both worlds.
you are exactly right. So to design a very flexible and and usable system by fixed point is really difficult. And remember, the complication of the DSP has changed a lot, right? If you compare, like in the 90s, like maybe EQ, delay, gain, compressor, you're done, right? But look at the DSP algorithms nowadays, right? You have a real-time dynamic EQ here. You've got a crazy peak limiter at the end, and then here you want a matrix mixer. I mean, once you get all those, and in each module you have to concern about the scaling, truncation, overflow. No, it's possible, but I won't go that route. Put it this way, right? Maybe some smart guy can do, okay, spend all their energy on working on each module and make sure the range is there and they use fixed point. They can achieve it, I think.
But you still don't know what the user is going to do in one module. Is he going to go crazy with one gain up in the beginning and down in the end? That
Yeah.
doesn't matter, you design all
Yeah.
this. You just get a lot of red LEDs.
Yeah, but on the contrast, like if you give this powerful engine floating point and the user can do whatever he wants, so maybe in the end he'll get some noise and distortion because he do like a 192 gain and then do the EQ and then something and then put up 192 gain. So maybe in the end he got more noise and distortion because he did some stupid things, right? But for fixed gain, he just cannot do it because once he do it this way, he does it this way, there will be no audio coming out because all shifted becomes 0. Can't do anything, right? So that's the difference. So some argument is, if floating point system messed up, you got distortion and noise, right? Fixed point say, okay, if you mess up, there's no sound. You just choose one, right?
And yet, if I understand it correctly, for a higher percentage of the time in most situations, the advantage is floating point. It has a lot of advantages, as you showed, right?
Yeah, I mean, conclusion, I've written down. Fixed point, it got its advantage, obviously. It's better resolution, as I've talked over and over again, right? From max to max minus 48. And if you need bit shifting, like doing some logics or something like that, fixed point is the way to go. Because floating point is not designed for shifting. Remember how IEEE defined the floating point? It is for math purpose. So 1 point, whatever fraction, times 2 to the power of exponent. So how can you shift that? You can shift it, but you get an approximate result, right? But for fixed point, shift, that's it. And it's simpler DSP silicon. I guess this gentleman, right? You asked about then the CPU has to be much more complicated inside because of the...
It's just doing more math is what I was
right.
saying, right? If it's doing more math, you're putting more
right.
in the machine.
So it comes to here, right? So the fixed point has simpler DSP silicon because it's less computation in the hardware.
And thus less expensive.
Yeah, it's less expensive. It's getting closer now, but still, it's still like different. Yeah.
Less power consumption.
Yeah, and power consumption. So once you go to like an iPhone or Android phone, right, then probably they'll choose fixed point, right, because of cost, of heat. Yeah.
Low hearing aids, I think.
Yeah. But of course, the disadvantage is you've got overflow, truncation, and longer development time, as I've mentioned. Floating point, advantages, extreme min-max range, impossible to overflow. Good thing. Smaller the number, the higher the precision. Good thing. Simpler and faster development without worrying overflow and truncation. Good thing for us. For the user, they don't care. For us, it does. Disadvantages, the extreme range is wasted. You recall the maximum is like 10 to the power of 38, right? Like, who will use that in audio? I don't know. Can that speaker stand that? 10 to the power of 38? I don't know. Everybody should go, huh?
So maybe we need a different IEEE floating representation for...
Yeah, that's a good one. Actually,
more bits in the mantissa and less in the exponent.
that's very good. You're listening. Yeah, if IEEE somehow comes up a standard for audio, let's say, right? So 32 bits have 28 and then 4 bits for exponent. So 2 to the power 4, right? So you can have, or 2 to the power 16, sorry, 4 bits, right? 2 to the power 16, 16.
If the video guys can use it, somebody will probably make the same silicon, but they won't do it for...
Yeah. But anyway, that's a very good point, though. That's a very good point. Like, as a developer, I really want to see that, but that's none. The only way we can do it is we have to go double precision, go with a 64-bit floating point. If you want more precision in the mantissa, right? And more complicated DSP silicon, which is obvious.
What about the psychoacoustics? Because I know the human ear is logarithmic by nature. So if you're listening to a very small sound, a perceived doubling of volume might only represent 2 or 3 bits. But if it's much louder, a perceived doubling of volume might be, 7 or 8 bits. So in that case, wouldn't the floating point have an advantage?
Well, I mean, the end of the day, math is math, right? So meaning, if you have 2 signals, one going through fixed point computation, one going through floating point computation, and it takes the result to the DAC, right? Both go to the DAC. So at the end of the day, you look at that number, is that closer to the original one to have less distortion, or is more different to have more distortion, right? So at the end of the day, I understand what you're saying, because I'm not in that field, right? It's all about psycho speakers, but I just talk about the technical aspect where we look at the results of the number sending to the DAC, and that's all I know. If that's less accurate, then means distortion, right?
At the end of the day, the DAC, it's a linear DAC, that becomes kind of a limitation, whereas if it's a non-linear DAC with the or whatever compression or expansion, then it becomes less of a
Yeah, well, today all the computation, expansion, everything is done in DSP. So it has to done everything and then give the DAC the result. Right.
That floating point must put much more constraints on the quality of the DAC, because the granularity of DACs, that's the biggest problem with conversion, is from the analog to digital, digital analog.
Mhm.
It's the different DACs, the resolution and the steps that they take. At floating point is going to place more demand on the granularity and resolution at the lower levels,
Mhm.
which a lot of DACs probably can't meet that.
Yeah, I think most of stuff I talk about, especially for the small signal, it applies more to the internal DSP computation.
Right.
So meaning within the DSP, maybe it comes in 0 dB, but down here when it's computing, it's like minus 60, and then do all kind of stuff, right? And then at the end of the day, it spit out 0 dB back to the DAC. I understand your point where if in case what the DAC can match the very precise granularity, very small, right, to match, then yeah. But I don't know if we've got any floating point DAC yet.
Not for audio.
Yeah, not for audio, right? So to answer your question is today we just have to live with the fixed point DAC. But still, the floating point is advantage because the result is closer than what you want. And that's the bottom line of it, right?
And then back to the, as somebody mentioned before a couple of times, back to each manufacturer decides, what they're going to use, not just in terms of fixed or floating, but the quality of the DAC they're using and all the other components.
Oh yeah, and well, that would be totally completely, different topic, right? The A to D, D to A, speakers, microphone, everything will become the factors, right? Yeah. Any question?
Where does DXD fit in all of this? Is that a hybrid system, sort of like this floating point that you're describing?
I'm not an expert on DXD. Anybody expert on DXD?
It's not a hybrid system.
Mm-hmm.
It's just PCM. It just happens to be the clocking is the closest that you can translate back to DSD. It just happens to be, the math makes it really, really good to use. It's pyramids that created DXD. It's really just 64 times, it's a 64 times, it's F8.
Because I thought it was like a bit stream
Yeah, it's
With-
like a
with- with an exponent.
right.
That was my understanding of DXD.
Well, not DXD recording, that's simply a PCM
Right.
recording, but you're using it inside the
Yes,
DSP.
inside the.
Then that's becoming something else. That's not DXD at that point then.
So really, DXD is just for
3.5.
portability.
Yeah.
You can carry
It's just, it's the closest they can get with pyramids, they're thinking. It's the closest approximation they can get to a 2.8 megahertz or 5.6 or 11.2. And the math is the best, that's the best math they've come up with.
Right.
So, you're using it, it's still PCM though. The capture medium is still
Right,
PCM,
sure.
but the math is the closest you can get to a 64 times DSD, or whatever the factorial is you want to use. Ed Meitner is doing it up to 16 times now. He's actually going from like Korg when doing their 11.2, but actually Ed Meitner in his latest experiments he's been doing it 16 times, 64. So he's getting into like but it's actually beneficial. He's actually saying that it actually is creating a more beneficial signal.
I had the opportunity one time to see Ed Meitner and Doug Sachs go at it
That'd be interesting.
over this very thing.
Yeah.
Floating fixed versus
Right.
versus DSD.
Well, Andy Moore was sort of the one that really, and you're making that point too, Andy Moore was the one that really kiboshed floating point in the early days. But he said it had to be 40-bit fixed, not 24. He said 24 is useless. So you have to be 40-bit fixed, which he says is better than 64-bit floating point.
32-bit, this paper was comparing it to 32-bit floating.
But against 40-bit fixed.
Yeah.
It comes down to workflow. You know, I was talking to merging guys at AES, and Stevie Wonder was pissed that he could only record 64 tracks in DXD.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're pushing the upper limitations of the system. So it comes back to what Michael was saying. You know, it's like, really, who's gonna consume this?
Yeah.
Who's gonna consume
Yeah.
this?
Well, yeah, but see, the problem with that, I mean, Desi Loop Productions. That's my answer to that, it's Desi Loop Productions, right? Lucille Ball, when they were shooting that show, they didn't want to shoot it in film. And Desi Arnaz and Lucy Ball said, you know what, we'll pay for it. We'll pay for a 3-camera, 35mm shoot on our own TV show. And guess what? The longest running syndicated show in the entire world is I Love Lucy. And guess who made all that money? Desi Loop Productions. In other words, you've got to think future-proof. You cannot think of this idea of this tiny little world. You've got to think of the future. Look at the recordings we listened to, 1961 jazz recordings. I mean, that's what people are going crazy for in high res right now. But something was done 50 years ago. You've got to think in those terms. If you want to stay here and think about in the small little world you want to be right now, then good on you. Because guess what? You're going to die.
Well done.
Okay. All right.
Future, man. You've got to future-proof your product.
It comes from the consumer. It comes from the
You don't,
consumer.
yeah, but the consumer's happy with HD tracks right now.
No, I'm talking the consumer of the technology for this stuff. If it wasn't for Stevie Wonder pushing merging into it, merging wouldn't be working towards that type of thing.
Sure.
So
And
it
you're-
comes from the consumer of the technology more than anything.
Yes.
And that is
11.2 on your Apple phone now, right? Apple 6?
Yeah. Is it really?
Yeah. You do 11.2 DSP on your Apple phone.
That's incredible.
So there you go. That's what I'm saying. It's there. It's happening.
Yeah.
Cool. Interesting.
There's one record on my entire phone. I can have one record on my phone.
All right.
Hopefully it's Stevie Wonder.
And I think
We might call it a night.
Songs to live by, DSP, I tell you, man, it's unbelievable. 11.2, good.
I'm not gonna put this on, I'm just gonna hold it. Great stuff, guys, really.
everybody can